Why guilt drains motivation. Guilt is often mistaken for motivation. People assume that feeling bad will push them to do better, that if they hold on to guilt long enough, it will eventually turn into action. But psychologically, guilt doesn't create movement. It creates weight. The mind doesn't respond to guilt by becoming more capable. It responds by becoming more defensive. Energy drops, resistance increases, avoidance quietly grows, and the person feels confused because they care, but they feel less able to act. Guilt focuses attention inward. Instead of thinking about the task, the mind turns towards self-evaluation. What should I have done? Why didn't I do it? What does this say about me? That internal focus consumes energy. The system becomes preoccupied with assessment rather than action. So even though guilt feels intense, it doesn't mobilize, it immobilizes. This is why people can feel deeply guilty and still feel completely stuck. The emotion feels active, but psychologically, it's draining. Over time, guilt changes how effort feels. Tasks become associated with self-judgment rather than purpose. Starting no longer feels neutral. It feels loaded. So the system resists, not because the person doesn't care, but because engagement now carries emotional cost. This creates a quiet loop. Guilt appears, energy drops, avoidance increases, more guilt follows, and the person believes they need more guilt to break it. But guilt is already the weight. This is why forcing motivation through guilt almost always backfires. The system doesn't move toward punishment, it moves toward relief. So when guilt rises, the mind looks for ways to escape the feeling. Distraction, delay, withdrawal, not because of weakness, but because relief feels necessary. The goal quietly shifts from progress to emotional regulation, and motivation fades further. Guilt doesn't fail because it's wrong. It fails because it's heavy. Progress begins when effort is no longer tied to self-judgment, when action doesn't feel like proof of worth. Motivation returns, not when guilt increases, but when emotional load decreases. That's when movement becomes possible again, not through pressure, but through permission. Guilt often feels necessary because it creates a sense of responsibility. Without it, people fear they would stop caring. They worry that if guilt fades, nothing will hold them in place. So guilt becomes a substitute for structure. It feels like proof that the goal still matters, but caring and punishing yourself are not the same thing. The system doesn't interpret guilt as commitment. It interprets it as threat, and when threat is present, the priority becomes protection, not progress. This is why guilt feels serious, but produces very little movement. Over time, guilt stops being about behavior and starts being about identity. It quietly shifts from "I didn't do this" to "I am someone who fails to do this." That shift is heavy, because now action isn't just effort. It's exposure. Trying again risks confirming the belief. So the system hesitates, not because it lacks discipline, but because it's protecting self-image. Avoidance becomes safer than effort, and guilt stays present, not as motivation, but as a constant background weight. Guilt doesn't motivate because it asks the system to move while carrying weight. Progress begins when effort is separated from self-worth, when action is allowed without emotional punishment. This doesn't require confidence. It doesn't require belief. It only requires one shift, reducing the emotional cost of trying. When guilt softens, energy returns, not all at once. Not dramatically, just enough to begin again without fear of judgment. That's when motivation reappears, not as pressure, but as capacity.